Hello, welcome to our webinar. Thank you for taking time out of your day to be here with us. My name is Talon Johnson. I'm the Marketing Manager at Global Upside and will be moderating the webinar. Before we jump into our topic, I do want to cover a few housekeeping items. First, a recording of the webinar and the slide deck will be shared with you via email upon completion of this session. Next, we've enabled the Q&A function, which will allow you to submit any questions that you have as you view the session. Our team will monitor any questions you submit, and we'll work to respond to those questions as quickly as possible. If we're not able to answer your question during the session, we'll be sure to email you a response upon completion of the session. If you have any additional questions, comments, or feedback regarding any specific details discussed during the session, we do encourage you to reach out to us directly by emailing us at marketing@globalupside.com. I'd now like to introduce our panelists. We'd like to welcome Andrew Wilson, who is the VP of Private Equity and M&A at Global Upside. Andrew is an English chartered accountant and has extensive international experience working in London, Lagos, Nigeria, Caracas, Venezuela, and San Francisco. We're excited to hear from Andrew as he shares his knowledge and insights with us. Next, we'd like to welcome Kim Sanderson, who is the Director of Human Resources at Global Upside. Kim possesses considerable experience in international HR. In previous roles, she has worked as part of internal international HR teams as well as in HR advisory functions. We are excited to hear from her as she shares her perspective given her in-depth human resources knowledge. It's now my pleasure to turn the time over to our panelists.
Thank you, Talon. Obviously, we're talking today about the pros and cons of direct and indirect hiring, and a lot of the decisions that you have to make when you initially do the acquisition or the spin-off, and whether they are the right decisions at the time in terms of your long-term strategy and what is the correct commercial and cost-effective way to actually organize the newly acquired business and move forward. So just summarizing in terms of obviously the crazy situations that do happen whilst you're waiting for the actual acquisition to close, and the uncertainties around the acquisition or the spin-off until you do have a definitive agreement and close and have to actually start executing. We're talking about both from the perspective of an asset acquisition or a share acquisition in terms of the decisions of how you're going to hire the personnel moving forward. So in making those decisions, obviously, they do happen quickly. You can have a philosophy in terms of what is your approach to hiring globally in different countries in terms of the commercial benefits of having legal entities or established operations in different countries, or moving with a small population to employ them through a PEO, through indirect hiring, having someone else hire them on your behalf, or even approaching it from the perspective of registering branches or setting up non-resident employer registration. So there are a number of possibilities that you're faced at the time. Because it do happen so quickly, a lot of companies, a lot of private equity firms do take the approach that the best option is to hire everyone through a professional employment organization so that you can affect the transition day one and make sure that with the PEOs, established legal entities, they can be hired and they can start working for you, and you are in compliance with transferring the existing terms and conditions of employment and providing the equivalent or comparable supplemental benefits. And that is, in some senses, it's the the easiest route to ensure that, especially in an asset acquisition, that you are maintaining those capabilities as you move forward through the transition. But if you have the time, and if you are able to set up the legal and tax structures that you're starting to consider that you want to adopt from a long-term perspective, then you can consider obviously directly transferring the employment and directly transfer the hires. So a lot of these decisions are made quickly, a lot of it's dependent upon timing, and a lot of it is a situation where you have made those decisions just to accommodate the fact that obviously you want to stand up the business on day one and make sure that everything is in place so that the employees are hired correctly, they're stood up on payroll and benefits, and they can start working effectively for the new organization and start generating the revenue for the new company and affecting as smooth a transition as possible. So very quick process in terms of making those transitions and what goes on, and may lead to forcing you into decisions about the hiring that may not be the correct decisions for the long term. Also, another consideration is whether should you set up legal entities for small populations. Obviously, from the rules as they relate to permanent establishment and tax nexus, there are situations, and the guidance varies. It can be up to 5 employees or up to 10 employees that you may not need to set up a legal entity to accommodate it to meet permanent establishment and tax nexus rules. And you can employ people on a PEO, so you can defer any long-term decisions. But again, one of those decisions about whether you should put the legal and tax structure in place in countries where you have small populations, or should you defer and just put them on a PEO and let them be employed and kept in compliance that way. Decisions about PEO hiring and the fact that often you have to pay the PEO on a per employee basis, monthly fees to hire the employees on your behalf and maintain the payroll, the taxes and benefits, leads you to an evaluation of, did you make the correct decision? Was it right to use a PEO? Are there commercial reasons why you might want to consider establishing a legal entity in these countries, or a branch, or even registering as a non-resident employer, that it may impact the significantly the cost of having to maintain employees in those countries? Did you inherit legal entities as it relates to the fact that you've done a share purchase and there was legal entities in place where you only have 1 or 2 employees? Do you want to evaluate whether you want to maintain those legal entities, or do you want to transfer the employees to a PEO and liquidate and extinguish the PEO? And again, a lot around what are the permanent establishments and tax nexus issues as you go country to country, because you do want to make sure, especially when you operate in these countries and you're trying to be a good citizen and maintain the situation with the local government, that you are cognizant of the fact of the risks associated with having a large population in that country and not having them employed through a legal entity. So again, talking about direct hires and interim hires, when does a PEO make sense? What are the pros and cons of using a PEO? What are the permanent establishment tax nexus issues? When should I consider hiring directly? As I said, in terms of just the immediacy of a decision and the fact that facilitating transfer of employment on day one to make sure that you are able to meet the terms of the purchase agreement, that you will transfer the employment, you will maintain the terms and conditions of employment by transferring their existing employment contracts, providing the comparable and equivalent benefits, the same compensation, the seniority, everything that goes into making sure that you're meeting the terms of the purchase agreement, and also that you are hiring these employees and being cognizant of the fact that the employees are probably the most important aspect of the business being brought over, to make sure they're stood up quickly and that they are really put to work in terms of effecting a smooth transition and getting the business operational up and running very quickly. So it is, in a lot of cases, the surest way to make sure that you can have a legal entity in the country, hire the people and stand them up and maintain them, and make anything happen from that perspective. Again, there's cost benefit. There's obviously the employment law risk and a lot of other things that go in these situations. So you have to be, certainly it's the quickest way to make sure that everyone gets transitioned if you don't have legal entities already in the country or don't have some form of capability to hire them directly. So definitely from that perspective, obviously there is a trade-off and a cost involved. And then there are the commercial considerations of, your new customers in each of the different countries, their perception of whether you're committed to staying in a country and are going to be able to support them effectively as you start the new business. So a lot of positives in terms of PEO. Having someone that acts as the employer of record gives you a lot of options in terms of the fact of you can certainly rationalize the business, and you can have the PEO handle any situations if you are looking to streamline the business, potentially execute workforce reductions, and make things like that happen. Although often the PEO will come back to you in terms of the liability for any risks associated with that does still come back to the company itself. And maintaining the situations in terms of making sure that even though you've transferred the employment to the PEO, that those risks are factored in as you manage the business going forward and look to streamline the operations. Did you have any comments on that, Kim?
I think one of the things with PEO is, whilst it is a very efficient way to carry out this part of a transition, as you were mentioning there is the liability. And the other thing to take into consideration with that is absolutely the fact that you will have your notice period with the PEO, and the PEO will have to manage it, but the termination can sometimes be a bit more tricky. And so working with the partner is absolutely the most important thing to do, and being open and transparent with it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Kim. I think that in terms of, obviously there's a strategy that has to, from an employment perspective, that has to be kept under consideration country by country, whether you do hire directly or indirectly, in terms of the transition of the employment and what's going on in that. And you may be in a situation where you're having to go through termination and rehire situations if you can't transition directly. So all of this in terms of the communication with the employee, how are you going to execute it, the comfort level of the employee in terms of what's going to happen to them, and whether they consider themselves valued as you bring them over, certainly affects that. And I think that from the perspective of using the PEO and making sure that they're in sync with what your strategy is as you approach it in each country, especially in terms of how valued the employee base, what your short-term and long-term plans are going to be in terms of attracting and retaining them, and making sure that they do stand up the business effectively is crucial. As we discussed, the permanent establishment and tax nexus issues are very prominent in these decisions. And certainly there's varying views of what is considered to be the right size population where the local governments will be looking at you to say, we really consider that you should be hiring these people directly, paying the payroll taxes and the statutory benefits correctly, and also being a good citizen and paying income taxes in the country, even if you do adopt a cost-plus relationship in terms of a legal entity, or if you actually start invoicing customers directly in the country. They're going to want to see that they maximize their income taxes, especially in the current environment. So a lot to consider. Certainly when you're hiring directly, the employment law risk does accrue to you. You do actually have to have, retain expertise as it relates to human resources, employment law counsel, things of that nature, where certainly companies like ourselves, as well as law firms, can assist you in this. But when you're going through those decisions about hiring directly, or what it is to have the PEO take on the employment risk and the associated need to make sure that you're in compliance and you handle any employment law matters in the country, very much a consideration. Global Upside is fortunate in that because we have our own PEO employer record networks, and we do support a lot of clients with their payroll, taxes, benefits, and human resources needs internationally. We can assist on both sides of the house, and we can handle transitions, be it from PEO to direct employment or direct employment to the PEO. So a lot of good things to consider there in terms of what's going on. And then from a business perspective, you are looking at it to say, in terms of your longer term strategy with the business, what are you looking to execute in terms of your, where you see the growth coming in the business, where you want to make sure that you have the right structures, you're looking to hire and expand the operations, really evaluating that in terms of what was your initial strategy on day one just to get the business over the line, stood up and operational, and then how that's going to affect your business's decisions as you move forward. Any more comments on that, Kim?
I think the main part, as you're saying, is there are a number of different ways to approach it that we can assist with. And I think I guess because I always come at it from the HR side, is just thinking, how are the employees going to react to it? And I think another part that's very pertinent is you could make a decision and think, yes, this could work. And then within 24 hours, you can receive an email or, something will change slightly in that country, and having to look at reevaluating and perhaps going, okay, do we need to do a mix of solutions? Do we need to have some of the entities on our entity, as it were? So actually like continuing over and setting up your own, or whether, part of it would be over to a PEO. And certainly we have seen clients who have done a mix of both. It isn't just a one or another solution. It really depends on the countries and the complexities of what you are buying.
Great point, Kim. I think the other, and certainly what you brought up in terms of being able to adapt on the fly and make changes, obviously one of the most difficult areas that we experience in the deals that we've done with private equity firms and working with other partners is from an immigration standpoint. And I think in terms of just being able to react and when you discover situations that have gone on and things that are going to affect the business going forward, from an immigration standpoint, you often find that you have to identify early on who is subject to work permits, visas, employment passes in each of the countries. If you are looking to hire directly or even indirectly, that discovering you have these situations going on and that the seller is in a position where they are looking for you to undertake the the employment of the individual where they are subject to a non-transferable work permit or visa, where they would need need to have a new work permit or visa issued to them to continue the employment, or if you can make the transfer. A lot of those situations that you need to react to is really finding out what are the requirements in the country, what needs to happen in terms of being able to transfer the employment, and what may happen to those individuals. We have been in the situations, especially from an immigration standpoint, where we've had to ask the seller to continue to employ the people for a period of time whilst we obtain the new work permits, or even have to have people just stay in the country unemployed, or even go back to their home country while we go through that execution. So a lot of things happen to you in terms of those situations. Again, it doesn't matter in that situation whether it's direct hire or indirect hire, but you are in those situations where immigration tends to be a factor that affects a lot of employment situations globally. And again, each one is unique to the country, and even unique to the fact that, when you're setting up legal entities, you may have to apply for immigration sponsorship licenses before you can apply for work permits. So difficulties occur in terms of getting that done on a timely basis and transitioning in the employment. And that can be a factor that should be brought up early in terms of the TSA and what's going on. To make sure that everyone's employment situation is dealt with, and negotiated prior to the day one transition in terms of making the things happen. So I just wanted to raise that type of point, because as Kim said, you need to react to the situations. And I think Kim, in terms of the transition of employment, as you said, you don't know what the employee's reaction is going to be. So you can get into a situation where, certainly you're trying to attract and retain these employees, and it can cause issues with them, right, Kim, that they may all of a sudden just decide that it's not for them, and you need to react in terms of what you can do for them.
Yes, absolutely. I think as humans, nobody likes change, and suddenly finding out that, okay, another company has bought part of your company, employees can be resistant. A lot of it is very much tied up into the messaging and being consistent with that messaging about what it means for them. I think with the current worldwide situation, and from an immigration point of view, this is actually quite important as well, but people's main fear at the moment is absolutely their job security, and that has to be a very strong part of any messaging. And regardless of whether there are going to be potential cuts, it's just being clear that what that means. But the point that I wanted to raise on immigration, actually, which only because I'm dealing with this at the moment with a few clients, is where various countries have actually extended visas. They're literally, in some countries, we are extending this for another 3 months, people not having to apply. It does make it a lot more complex at the moment. And also, for the best part of 10 weeks, a lot of the immigration bureaus in country have been shut down due to the COVID situation. And so there are all sorts of delays, not just for people going through the system, but if any sale is going through at the moment and you're looking at dealing with employees who have a visa related issue that their employment is dependent on, there are huge backlogs. So what Andrew was just mentioning in regards to having employees stay with their previous company or looking at other solutions, with the COVID situation, to call it that, a lot of the timelines are making things a lot more difficult. And sorry for taking it on a slight tangent.
Oh, no, I think it's great points. I mean, we're even having difficulties at the moment with incorporating legal entities and registering them for the payroll taxes and the statutory benefits, so we can start paying payroll, benefits, and taxes. So, great points at the moment. It's like every country is experiencing difficulties, and as you said, it's as countries start to open up, these things will slowly start getting resolved. But there's a huge backlog build up over the last few months, and it certainly is affecting your ability to do employment and stand up payroll and benefits as we speak. So, great point. I know we'll be talking about COVID a little bit later into the presentation.
I think one of the things to take into consideration is supplemental benefits. So when I'm talking about supplemental benefits, this is essentially what I would call the bells and whistles benefits, which is any sort of enhanced pension, the medical cover, the life insurance, any of the schemes whereby someone may have had their gym membership subsidized. When buying or acquiring a business, these are all things that you need to look at. In certain countries, and again, this is my main area, but talking about Europe, there is going to be the obligation that you keep those benefits, not just the same. In some cases, you may end up having to enhance them because you may not be able to get the same sort of coverage. I think looking at this from a analytical point of view is trying to understand at an early stage what employees have in each country and how you are going to be able to replicate them. Now, one of the main difficulties that I have seen and experienced through doing this is if you are acquiring a business that is a small part of a much larger business, employees are used to having a very comprehensive benefits setup. And there's two factors to take into account with this when you are looking at either replicating these benefits or considering what else you're able to offer to put in place. Firstly, from a employment size point of view, it may not actually be possible for you as a company to continue those benefits as they are. A lot of these supplemental benefits providers in countries will quote based purely on the headcount size. So if you're acquiring, say, 20 people and previously there's been 2,000, then you are not going to be able to get the same sort of rates or even access in some cases to the same sort of company who the employees are looking at. From a cost side as well, there is also the fact that you may have employees' dependents. So considering whether something that has been contractually offered is going to be able to be continued. One of the difficulties I certainly seen clients have is not actually having access to all of that information in order to get quotations that are going to work. Most of the time, you would be considering to a large extent, okay, this is what they have in place as of now. How can we best look to replicate? And if not replicate, how best to compensate them for what they may be perceiving as they are losing. Again, this would depend entirely on the size of the business. And another consideration is, again, this goes back to the idea and notion that people get very uncertain and are thinking, what do I stand to lose? When I've done this previously, we have always generated Excel sheets and slides to show that everything that is going to be offered is comparable, even if it isn't the same company name. Looking at the times of changing the benefits, ordinarily with supplemental benefits, you will find as part of any acquisition, then your employees will lose any of their benefits from the incumbent company, as it were, as of day one. So you'll be looking at having them set up on the first day. I know with a lot of transactions, you don't necessarily have everything all set on the first day as it is, let alone the benefits. But certainly setting up comprehensive benefits can take time. So it's something to factor in when looking at getting as much of the employee information as possible. And I think one point to raise on this when considering the potential move to a PEO, setting up a supplemental set of benefits on your own entity is not a simple process, but certainly you are doing it as part of your own entity, even if you don't have all of the registrations complete. So you do have free rein to try and replicate or do what you want. I think with PEOs, the one thing to note and remember here is they would not be your employees. And certainly one of the difficulties tends to be employees going, wait, what do you mean I'm going to lose access to my, full medical coverage for me and my spouse and my children, and how does that work? In a lot of cases, a PEO company will not be able to replicate the sort of benefits because they have a number of clients, and we certainly do, that you cannot just, have a scheme and enroll certain people. It's a logistical and legal nightmare. And in that case, there tends to be stipends, which is essentially offering an amount to an employee to compensate them for the perceived loss and I suppose the actual loss of benefits. Do you want to add anything on that, Andrew?
Yeah, I think that, as you're discussing in terms of whether it's the PEO or whether it's you're trying to set up, the pension plans, the private medical insurance, the life insurance, disability insurance, meal vouchers, daycare vouchers. I mean, it is important, especially from a due diligence phase, to really understand what is currently in place in terms of ensuring that you can maintain the terms and conditions of employment and bring people through. And there is that consideration of whether you can provide the equivalent or exactly the same benefits or comparable benefits, which are, won't trigger any sort of variation in terms and conditions of employment, which can obviously be taken by the employee as a form of involuntary termination. So it is very advisable early on to have that assessment done. Obviously, you can certainly work with some of the global providers like Mercer, AJ Gallagher, Lockton, Aon, in terms of doing that for you and getting ahead of the game, or we do that type of work ourselves in terms of making those assessments and putting it in place. But often from a lead time perspective and making sure that you're prepared for day one, that is one of the most important factors from whether it's direct hire or indirect hire, of making sure that you've addressed that and that you put a lot of the policies in place and your inability to actually do sign-ups in advance of the day one acquisition. And then I think from the perspective that again, you're making sure that from a timing perspective that you've got everything in place so you can affect the transition day one. But as Kim was pointing out, often you're doing a spin-off or an acquisition from a very large corporation, which has a very rich benefit package, which is geared towards a certain type of population, which may not be appropriate for your new company in terms of what you're looking to do and the direction and business and the types of workforce that you're going to have moving forward. So there's that reevaluation phase, which is often as you approach the anniversary, if you've done a acquisition during the year and then you're looking for renewals at the end of the year, where it is a good time to reevaluate, certainly from a cost saving standpoint, because you may be paying a lot for benefits that you really don't need for the type and age of your population. And secondly, that you may actually be able to find benefits packages that you can achieve cost savings and provide better benefits for the employees. So again, really looking at evaluating it. It is a big expense in terms of the overall scheme of things, in terms of supporting your workforce. And certainly there is a lot you can do, and you may not have made the right decisions on or you're forced into decisions on day one that you can reevaluate as you move forward. So again, a great area to consider, especially as you move forward and think about what's happening in terms of really providing the best benefits for your employees, and certainly sensitizing yourself that day one there is an overriding objective to make sure that you're not triggering any sort of situation with the employees in terms of varying their terms and conditions of employment. But as you move through it, then there are opportunities to reevaluate what you have as you move forward.
Excellent points. Thank you, Andrew.
So converting employees from the PEO, EOR, I think the overriding consideration in terms of the PEO employer of record is that they are hiring the employees directly on your behalf. You have no legal presence in the country, typically, and therefore you have no ability to employ the person. And from an employment law perspective, the PEO is completely responsible for their hiring, their payment of the payroll taxes, statutory benefits, their compliance from a human resources standpoint, and also the association. So from the perspective of an employment law liability, totally accrues to the PEO, EOR. Obviously, they're going to demand in their, their services agreement with you that you provide them with the security in terms of backing them in terms of what anything that happens in the country as it relates to the transition of employment, and then any situations from a voluntary or involuntary termination perspective that you're responsible for any liability that comes through that. But from the actual hiring perspective and ongoing support of the employee, the PEO is totally responsible, and they make sure that they are executing from that perspective. Now, it is indirect employment. You don't have any legal presence in the country. So if you do decide at a future point in time for commercial reasons, or from the perspective that it's going to be more cost effective for you to actually hire the people directly, so incorporating your own legal entity, or registering a branch, or registering as a non-resident employer in the country, so that you can hire the personnel directly and set up the payroll and benefits, then in most cases, you are going to have to go through a termination or rehire situation, because often the PEO will want to make sure that there is a clean break in terms of the employment. So they are going to want to terminate the employment, often with, preferably with a situation where they've got a settlement agreement that addresses the terms of ending it, especially if you have transitioned an existing employment agreement from their previous employer, which had factors in it such as seniority, entitlements to certain benefits, certain compensation requirements. So they want to make sure that they're covered from the perspective that they don't trigger any future liability from that perspective. And then you're going to have to go through a rehire situation. So I think a lot of those situations, sometimes you can work with the PEO. Certainly with our PEO legal entities, we will work with you to transition that employment agreement today again to the new legal entity. So again, it's like we're maintaining the terms and conditions of employment. So from the employee's perspective, it's certainly they can see the continuity, and they can see the reasoning behind the fact that you are making sure that from an employment standpoint, they're being kept whole, they're being provided with the same compensation, the same benefits, the same seniority. Everything is really being done to try and maintain their employment, and provide them with exactly what they have, so they can focus on your objective of obviously standing up a business and making sure it happens in terms of them, being focused and looking to execute the business and not worrying about their employment situation. So again, going through too many sort of situations where you from a timing perspective or from a strategy perspective, because you want to consider your options in each of the countries, the PEO certainly is a great way to go initially in terms of making sure that they are employed and they are making that happen. May cause you issues as you go through and then reevaluate what you want to do in each of the countries and say to yourself that it makes sense for you from a strategic perspective to actually have a subsidiary in that country to be servicing your customers or bring in your products to sell in those countries. So from that perspective, and just putting your employees through a number of different employment situations, and then try and make sure that you don't trigger anything that's going to cause potential liability to the PEO or to yourself, is certainly important. And then the supplemental benefits, as we previously discussed, if you're trying to maintain those, make sure they're in place, then again, you're going from the one transition from the seller to the PEO, and then another transition, and all of the work that's involved in terms of trying to make sure that the pension plans, the life insurance, disability insurance, private medical insurance, everything that they're offering is in place, and making sure that you're not triggering anything that may cause additional liability. Any points on that, Kim?
I think from my side and the HR side is very much along the lines of what you were saying. People just get very nervous or wondering, why are you doing this? Especially when you're starting to have discussions with them about, okay, we need you to resign from this entity, and making sure that you have all the documents ready so that people can move as seamlessly as possible. It makes for a lot better employee experience, as opposed to thinking, oh gosh, and now I need to move to this entity and what's happening here. So as always, I think just being concise as to what the intention is at that point. And as we were saying earlier in this, Andrew, it can change very quickly, and you may end up having to change decisions even just a couple of months down the line. But just being clear on what you are trying to achieve and how it benefits the employee at that time, I think for me is one of the most important messages. So looking at this from the other way, so if you have employees who you are inheriting and you're not planning to set up an entity or any sort of liability in that country, then just to look at this in reverse as to how you would then look to putting employees onto a PEO. It is absolutely entirely possible. And I think one thing to bear in mind, and certainly from a legislation side, this is perhaps one of the most important things, is the employees are going to have current contracts that are going to have seniority. You may have works councils who are involved from the company who are buying. You may have employee reps who've been elected in various places. You may end up, before the actual TSA has been signed, having groups being set up who are approaching you and asking for recognition. So when looking at moving over to a PEO, I think one of the main considerations is from a cost side of things, and also from a size of the population who you have in that country as to what makes sense. If you have a small amount of employees, then yes, absolutely, it probably would make more sense to put somebody onto a PEO whilst you are perhaps even working out, do you wish to have a liability in that country? Another thing to work with on the PEO, whether that is ourselves or another company, is the acquired rights that the employees have. So the TUPE side from a European side, and there are laws that are applicable in other countries in regards to this. Is that PEO company going to be able to recognise what you legally need them to recognise? You would be asking a PEO company potentially to be taking on the additional liability in regards to a number of years of service. They may have had enhanced terms. when we've dealt with this previously for other clients, we have seen all sorts of contracts and addendums come out of employee files where things have been guaranteed at a previous stage. So it would be working with the PEO provider in order to see, can this actually work? One part with collective bargaining agreements moving to PEOs, you in some countries will have a collective bargaining agreement that will be applicable to the parent organization. When moving over to a PEO, you will find that a lot of PEO companies are not going to have that same collective bargaining agreement that you have currently, or that the employees currently have. I think the thing with collective bargaining agreements is they are not homogenous. You do get a number of different levels, and most PEOs, and we're included in this, will use a consultancy type collective bargaining agreement. You can always ensure that an employee will fit in with the framework, but it may look very different to what they have seen before. Collective bargaining agreements can affect things like statutory holiday. It really depends on what the company who are buying or acquiring from have. Certainly having a side-by-side comparison of what those terms are and how it may change and how you are going to work through an employee and explain to them precisely what it means are very important. And from a Works Council and union side, I know I touched on this briefly with the employee reps. Certainly if you are having or acquiring from a large company, there is the likelihood that you are going to have Works Councils involved who will have had to agree sometimes as to whether the employees are even happy to move across. Some countries do have very low thresholds in regards to having Works Council recognition, and certainly from a union perspective as well, the threshold in most countries, as an employer, you do not have to recognise a union, but the employees are entitled to their own representation. Now, that is going to continue over if they move to a PEO. And certainly on a PEO model, most of the time, because we work with different clients and payroll and sort things out in that way, we do not have Works Council representatives because essentially it is just that employee. However, one thing that I have noticed, and this has become quite prevalent, whether it's someone who is being converted from a direct hire or even someone who we are employing on a PEO, is because employees are not familiar with this model, they do not necessarily understand why they are being asked to be hired via a third party, is that lawyers are being asked to look at the contracts, to review, to confirm what that means. And I think from a cost perspective side, it is important to recognize this, because if you are asking employees to perhaps be hired via a PEO, then there may be legal costs that an employee may have, and it would be a consideration in order to seal the deal, perhaps to contribute to that. But that would come down entirely to a business decision. Do you want to comment on that, Andrew?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of factors go into this, and as Kim's pointing out, I mean, certainly from a not varying the terms and conditions of employment and making sure that you have addressed that. But again, it's a lot more difficult, at the stage of trying to convert employees from direct hire to a PEO situation where you have existing legal structures in place in the country, and that you are taking that risk in terms of going through that exercise of transitioning their employment, and whether you can maintain their terms and conditions as they transition over to the PEO. And then you do have to go through, if you do have a subsidiary, a legal entity in the country, then going through the liquidation and extinguishment of those entities can take anything up to 2 years. And then there's always the question that while you're going through that process, that the government can take a view that you're deliberately trying to vary the terms and conditions to escape your obligations to the employee as it relates to their rights, be it the Acquired Rights Directive, be it to pay, be it collective bargaining agreements, unions. So I think that you have to be very cognizant that it is, there's always risks going to be associated with it, and it may be the correct decision, and certainly rationalizing your footprint in terms of what's going on in the various countries and whether you are intending to, to maintain a long-term commercial presence in that country. So something to be very cognizant of. And as I said, it is a lot more difficult to convert if you have direct hires to start converting them over to the PEO. That's certainly not impossible, and certainly the risks vary depending on the number of employees in the country, but certainly something to be cognizant of. So we've obviously talked a lot about the varying options, and certainly the current COVID-19 situation is very prevalent in terms of what is the long-term future, and certainly a lot of companies are recognizing that work from home can be at least as, if not more, productive than working from an office, and certainly can be more cost-effective in terms of not having to maintain structures of offices in each country, and then having to support them with the expense of the office plus the finance team support and everything that goes with it. So another thing to consider in terms of as you make these decisions and look to rationalize and streamline your existing portfolio companies and address situations which you may have had to make quick decisions as you transitioned over, in terms of setting up permanent offices, or providing the support personnel to support the employees in those offices, and the size of populations that you have in those. So again, certainly from an individual employee's perspective, there's certainly a lot of people do think it's much more beneficial for them to work at home, and it's certainly a life benefit to them to be able to have flexible work hours and to adapt to their family needs as they work from home as working in our office environment. So it can affect a lot in terms of your decision-making process, certainly with your existing portfolio companies, going forward in terms of what do you really need to support the employees in those countries. Is it best to work virtually? And I think that it's opened up a lot of new possibilities in terms of being able to look for the best talent globally in terms of what's going on in the world to support your organization, and not being tied by the fact that you're certainly got to consider countries where you have a lot of fixed infrastructure already in terms of what's going on. So I think that, again, it's a great time to evaluate existing portfolio companies. What decisions were you forced to make on day one, and what you did acquire in terms of infrastructure from the seller and the support operations, and what could appeal to the workforce moving forward, as well as be best suited to supporting your business. So I think a great time to be recognizing that, obviously for the greatest reasons in the world, and certainly from an empathetic standpoint, certainly a lot of people have been affected negatively by the current crisis, which we hope will come to resolution certainly within the next 12 to 18 months. But again, something to evaluate that may have been forced upon you or your portfolio companies in the short term, but really could be looked at in terms of providing opportunities for you to improve the operations and improve the working life of the employees as we move forward. Any comments on that, Kim?
I think for me, with COVID and the impact on workforce, the main comment that I have is with people predominantly now working from home is regardless of whether you're in the middle of an acquisition or as Andrew was just saying in regards to, moving and reevaluating and making other decisions, is how best to communicate. I think my experience so far, having seen clients deal with this, is people are beginning to get, and I'm going to probably coin another word, but zoomed out, because people are having to be on camera whilst dealing with multiple things. And I think any communication around all of these changes is also just bearing in mind it can be very easy to put everyone onto a Zoom call, but it's understanding, I think, perhaps how well people are listening and whether that message is better coming in smaller groups and how you work it out. And obviously it depends totally on what sort of teams that you are working with, whether people are able to meet or get together in a socially distanced way, or as Andrew was saying, if people are entirely spread across the world, and there is no one size fits all. And I realise that may be a slightly odd point, but I think having seen a number of meetings where 50 people join and only one employee will speak, I think it's just something to bear in mind with any sort of changes to people being based at home.
We've reached the conclusion of the webinar session. We'd like to thank our panelists for their time and insights they've shared with us. We'd also like to thank you for the time you spent with us today. As a quick reminder, we'll send you the webinar recording and slide deck via email in case you'd like to review anything in the future. Also, if you've submitted any questions during the session that we weren't able to answer, we'll be sure to send you a response via email as quickly as possible. If you have any follow-up questions, comments, or feedback, please feel free to reach us via email at info@globalupside.com. We hope you have a great day ahead.